Now, this evening's event is with the wonderful Will Self, I'm sure he won't mind me calling him that, who is a professor of contemporary thought here at Brunel University. He teaches on any number of modules in our English department. Probably the most popular of those modules is the psychogeography module, which I know is very, very popular with students, and I don't know if there are any here who are going to be studying that module. Maybe there are. There's one. Okay, great stuff. Well, student feedback for that module is just amazing. However, many of you will probably know Will much more in his role as a public intellectual, one of our great public intellectuals in the UK, author, journalist, essayist, and broadcaster, of course, and a broadcaster who deliberately, and perhaps this is a theme that he may touch on this evening, who deliberately broadcasts in radio rather than in the visual medium, and there are clear reasons why he does that. Now, I've known Will for about 6 years, I think, and it just occurred to me, in fact, that I've only known Will Self while he's been involved in some way with this magnificent trilogy of books, the final episode of which he's going to be discussing this evening, that many of us believe is a really, really important contribution to contemporary culture. Now, you will know many of Will's books, so I don't need to introduce you to him in relation to those. But in terms of this trilogy, which he is talking about the third episode tonight, as I say, Umbrella in 2014, I think, Shark, which he was here talking about last year, and which he's going to talk about tonight, the final episode, is Phone. Now, I don't know how many of you have read any of those. I'm halfway through this one, Will, page 283 to be precise. Enjoying it enormously. It's an incredibly overwhelming experience reading this trilogy. One has to immerse oneself in it, I would say, and it's quite interesting, and again, I hope Will might talk about this tonight. When one thinks about phones and modern phones, how distracting they are and what a distractive culture we live in, Will's literature, this trilogy particularly, is, I would say, the kind of opposite of that. One must really immerse oneself in the reading of these books. Anyway, that's enough from me. Let me introduce to you, please welcome the wonderful Will Self.
Thanks so much. Well, thanks very much, Bill. And Bill's somewhat hiding his light under a bushel, because in fact he and Phil Chew, who's sitting over there, are kind of responsible for bringing me to Brunel in the first place. And as Bill said, this trilogy of novels was effectively given birth to here and nurtured here at the university, and I'm extremely grateful to a very, I mean, I know I don't, possibly to some of my colleagues, cut the most collegiate of figures, but nonetheless, I'm actually very grateful to the atmosphere here at Brunel and the support of those colleagues. You know, I think actually it was you, Bill, who said to me when I came here, many people in your position come into a university environment and it's the writing that suffers. And that certainly hasn't been the case with me. I've found an incredibly fruitful synergy from working with students, engaging with their preoccupations, teaching texts here in all the weird and wonderful ways I do, because the psychogeography module is in a sense a literary module. In many ways it's about the psychology of place, which is so important in my fiction, and I think in fiction generally. So it's been great, and yes, my time here, I realise I've been 6 years here at Brunel, and it spans the history of this trilogy. Bill also touched on the kind of immersive quality of these books and the way they're written. And many years ago in an interview, I made an aside, a comment that has haunted me as a writer ever since. And the remark was, I don't write for readers. And almost every mainstream review of my work that's been published since, this has been held up as a flag above my alleged obscurity and difficulty as a writer, the baroque vocabulary, the odd approach, and so on and so forth, let alone the actual subject matter. And, you know, I never meant that I didn't write to be read, or that I didn't write for readers in the, you know, ideal sense. What I was adverting by this statement was that the distinction in my mind between literary art and marketing is that a serious artist always creates for everyone, for no specific reader, no demographic group, no AB1s in the potteries who also drive a Volvo, but anybody who wishes to pick up a book. And the great joy, I think, and you know, Jonathan Coe's still here, I didn't, there may be many other writers in the room, the great joy, I think particularly of fiction, is that in the literary text, we meet each other shorn of all contingent factors, gender, class, age, ethnicity, nationality, and there we contrive the most incredible creative intimacy together, because to my way of thinking, the best texts invite the reader to join in the enterprise with as much imagination as the writer, sometimes with more. And in recent years, as I've been working on this trilogy, the word that has come into reviews of the works, while they've been lauded, and in a couple of cases the phone is up for a prize, Umbrella lost the Booker by a short nose. In fact, Peter Stoddart, the chairman of the Booker Committee's nose to Hilary Mantel's novel. Nonetheless, this D word has been a kind of colossal rumble strip, I feel, to my readers. And every time it's mentioned in a review, my heart sinks as I think the text is not going to find its readers. Because I think that the problem with our contemporary literary culture, as the novel becomes less central to our culture in general, is that the aspiration is no longer there with readers. This idea that when you become a reader and move forward as a reader, that in a sense, just as the writer advances, so the reader advances. You know, I'm not claiming, you know, James Joyce felt that every Dublin taxi driver should have read Ulysses. And in a way, the 20th century does represent a literary culture full of that aspiration. And my sad feeling is that in our culture, as I say, with the novel losing its position in the center of the culture, that aspiration is gone. And every time I hear the D word, I groan. I think the TLS review of this novel described it as embuggeringly difficult, which made me feel like going round to Sam Leith, the critic's house, and doing something to him. And I did an event for it actually in Islington a few months ago with Professor John Mullen, who's Professor of English Literature at University College London. And John Mullen kept going on about the difficulty of the text on the stage, and eventually I just lost my temper with him and said, for Christ's sake, John, you are the Professor of English Literature at UCL. You know fine well that this isn't a particularly difficult text. Are you engaged in some bizarre act of professional closure, telling the ordinary reader, this is too difficult for you, you'll never understand this, go away, you proles? And so off the back of that, I've decided to hit back. And you know, I may not write for specific readers, but you're the specific potential readers that are actually in the room with me. So I'd like to use the rest of the time we have available together to try and persuade you that far from being embuggeringly difficult, I think, you know, again, in contrast, the review in the Daily Mail, of all places, described reading the novel as sliding after a while into a warm bath. So, you know, that doesn't sound embuggeringly difficult to me unless you get up to things in your bath that I don't. So, it's an arresting image. And the text is full of them. I rest my case. So, you know, I think I'd like to sort of talk a little bit about the themes of the book and read you a few passages, and hopefully you'll find that far from being embuggeringly difficult, it's beautifully lubricated and slides easily into your psyche. I don't know how far I'm going to extend this metaphor. I may only stop later tonight. The three novels and the themes of the novels, as Bill touched on in his introduction, are the relationship in the 20th century between technological innovation, human psychopathology, and warfare. And my view is that the history of the 20th century can best be seen as a series of evolutions in the interrelation of these three factors. It's very difficult in our culture, I think, to look neutrally at the relationship between humans and technology. The post-Enlightenment view remains one of Promethean advance. The idea is that and I was reading an interview with the CEO of Google on the way out here to Uxbridge on the Metropolitan line. The kind of standard operating procedure for technology is that we humans create fantastic new technologies that make our lives better and easier in every way. That's the slug line. And perhaps the signature form of technology for us is medicine, which still seems to us, even in the 21st century, as some kind of amazing magic, as indeed it is. There are still people alive who can remember how the world was before the invention of antibiotics and any other drugs that counteract sepsis. There are many people alive who saw many people die from easily treatable maladies. I think that medicine holds sway in our minds like a new religion, and it makes us very open to accepting the other claims of technology as a wholly beneficent phenomenon. But actually, when I look at the history of the 20th century, I see a bizarre and non-causal synchrony between mounting hysteria, for want of a better word, in the human population overall, and forms of technology that are more and more inherently destructive. In Umbrella, the first novel of the trilogy, I looked at manufacturing industry as a form of technology. I looked at a weird disease called encephalitis lethargica that took the form of a worldwide epidemic shortly before the Spanish flu epidemic that ended the First World War. And I united these with the trench system in Flanders itself. I found it odd in the extreme and hardly serendipitous that within 6 years of the first production line for the Model T Ford being opened by Henry Ford in Detroit, what was effectively assembled in France and Flanders and snaking across the French countryside was a sort of giant assembly line of death. The combination of the 50 caliber machine gun and trench systems created the most efficient killing zone that humanity had ever seen. Yet nobody foresaw it, nobody willed it, it was just something that happened. It's the same really with the Second World War and the advent of the atomic bomb. If you imagine the world in 1925, there were probably 200 people alive at that time who knew with a certainty that it was possible to create a thermonuclear device. None of them wanted it to happen. And yet, a scant 20 years later, 150,000 Japanese, largely civilians, had their lives eliminated in a fraction of a second by just such a weapon. My argument really in these novels is that technology, far from being instrumental or far from being some sort of gift from the gods, is immanent in human being. It bodies out from us. It's just stuff we do. Nobody really invents it. Nobody really wills it intentionally. And I laugh when I hear people speak about technologies as if they were some kind of, that they weren't effectively a zero-sum game, bringing with them as many disadvantages as they do advantages. And the second novel, Shark, deals with the Second World War and the dropping of the atomic bomb, and the curious and weird coincidence, in my view, that the ship that delivered the payload for Little Boy, the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, was also the last ship to be sunk, American naval ship to be sunk in the Pacific War, being torpedoed shortly after delivering the payload. And the men of that ship, the Indianapolis, went into the water, 1,000 of them, and was subjected to the world's biggest recorded shark attack. I think up to 900 of them were killed by sharks. And in the novel, I kind of project this in a weird, fantastical way as a kind of proleptic revenge on the part of Mother Earth against humanity for sullying her waters and skies with this toxicity. Rather weirdly, just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the wreck of the Indianapolis was finally discovered on the bed of the Pacific after all of these years. We come to the third novel, To Phone, and I always knew I was going to end up with the Iraq War as the war I was going to concentrate on, and I always knew inevitably that it would be what I call bidirectional digital technology, the combination of the web and the internet, that would form the technological focus. In Shark, the psychopathology, I believe, was unleashed by the dropping of little boys, a kind of psychosis that I believe has gripped humanity ever since the 6th of August 1945. I think the consciousness among us that we possess the means of our own destruction makes our entire species like a man sitting on the ledge of a high building, wondering whether he's going to jump the next second. And with the third book, it was inevitable that I would end in Iraq, and inevitable I would end with this technology, which the older people here will remember the first Gulf War of 1991, and will remember watching Newsnight at the time, when in the days before bidirectional digital media, when national television, terrestrial television, commanded huge audiences. And we all watched that war on Newsnight, and we all watched a then TV presenter called Peter Snow as he directed miniature tanks around in a sand pit to describe what was going on in the Kuwaiti and Iraqi desert. But what we also remember about the coverage was that it brought something called the smart bomb to our attention, and there was footage from nose-mounted cameras of ordnance plunging towards the Iraqi city. It's interesting to step back from that objectively and think of the grotesque triumphalism implied in a nation prepared to sit farting on its sofas and watching the view of a bomb about to kill people. And I think even at that point in 1991, I realized we were in a new era of this strange technological dialectic and this strange development of our own collective consciousness. So in Phone, I try to track the progress or the movements of 4 characters across this strange new techno-psycho-logical landscape. One of them is my longtime protagonist, Dr. Zach Busner, who's a psychiatrist. He's what we might call an anti-psychiatrist. He was involved very much with a psychiatrist called R.D. Laing and thinker called R.D. Laing in the 1960s, and he's been involved in all sorts of heterodox treatment over the years. And now in Phone, he's 78, and he's beginning to be afflicted with, as it were, the pathology of the novel, or one of the central pathologies of the novel, which is Alzheimer's. He's starting to lose his memory. And in this scene that I'm going to read to you now, Busner, having checked into the Hilton Hotel in Deansgate, Manchester, is having a rather strange encounter with one of the managers. A world is shimmering into being, Busner thinks, bodying forth from the handset the manager of the Podium restaurant holds clamped against his head. Visible waves of materiality ripple into the human spectral range, bearing this flotsam upon their crests. Eamon Holmes, slapped across a wall-mounted flat-screen telly, a news thread ever unzipping his comfortable belly. A whole melon poised on a mound of crushed ice, its flesh elaborately tooled into tight, leafy tessellations, so it resembles a monstrous artichoke. Beyond this, a more shape-shifting legume, a forest of miniature carrot trees surrounded by swirls of cucumber and tomato roundels. A steel tripod bearing a jungly mess of salad leaves and multicolored peppers. Further away, through the misty atmosphere, Busner spots an entire continental section, frills of ham and cooked meats, cheese slices fanned out around an entire gouda on a wooden trencher. And there are people, guests, shuffling along the counter, tonging black bread, dill pickles, mini muff things and full-sized croissant onto their already high-piled plates, or spooning porridge into deep white bowls, or thrusting specialist scoops into Tupperware tubs full of organic muesli, honey nut cornflakes, and Rice Krispies blebs. All Busner can see is his own head waggles furtively, first to the right, then to the left, are other heads hanging in the air, eerily illuminated by the spotlights above the counter, disembodied by the steam rising from it. They are, he thinks, each and every one, a world entire, around which all this orbits, all the coconuts and the curries and the Castlefield Canal. All conditioned phenomena are a dream, an illusion, a bubble, a shadow, like dew or a flash of lightning. Thus shall we perceive them. He holds this thought while thinking that it too is a conditioned phenomena. Then all at once is puffed up with giddy spiritual pride. Perhaps this is it, he exalts. I've slipped into enlightenment as a lesser man might a bath. But then, he considers, that's exactly the sort of pride which can lead novices into the most awful, glistening, glutinous, sickly smelling swamp. Busner's gaze wanders from the serving dish heaped with baked beans into a charnel house, glinting, calcified slices of black pudding, oozing grease, still greasier sausages, and a great Rattenkönig of bacon, smeared with globs of white fat, its rinds woven into a gristly plate. This is where desire, that most conditioned phenomena of all, ends, he acknowledges wearily, in the abattoir, where the poor beast is first poleaxed and then flayed. The manager, it says as much on the badge he wears on his lapel, has freed his ear from the wall-mounted phone behind the breakfast buffet and shimmered into a dark green suit with lighter green silken lapel facings, pocket flaps, and reveres. Would you come with me, The manager's opening salvo is sung over by the smartphone in Busner's pocket, which bursts into life, throbbing in a hand that had forgotten it was holding it. This old man, he played knick-knack on my thumb. Ringing tones that lance between Busner and the manager, then pierce the wavering heads further along the buffet, looping them into, with a knick-knack, paddywhack, give a dog a bone. The manager, Busner's amused to see, cannot proceed. He is held in check by the singing, ringing thing I hold. This old man came rolling home. Busner withdraws the smartphone from his pocket, and together this old man and the manager stare at its screen while the rondo continues. This old man, he played too, he played knick-knack on my shoe. No caller ID. The semantics of this simple statement bother Busner. How should this be interpreted? Is it that the caller is devoid of an identity due to some psychological or physical trauma? Or is it the smartphone which is unable to establish the identity of the person making the call? The latter would seem more logical and to be consistent with Busner's, albeit hazy, telecommunications knowledge, although to support the former comes this paddywhack notion. Surely only a sentient machine could establish that the entity contacting it is devoid of self-consciousness. That the smartphone's self-aware seems indisputable, since it continues to cry out, "Give a dog a bone," and launches into the next verse. "This old man, he played 3," with positively gay abandon, while the manager and the disembodied heads are unable either to look away or to intervene. Busner can remember well enough when his grandson, Ben, downloaded the ringtone. "Choose something catchy that you'll definitely remember, Gramps," he'd said, "'cause you can have just about anything you want as a ringtone, and when you're in public, it's confusing if you hear a phone ringing and don't know if it's yours, and don't know if it's yours." Yes, it was confusing. Ever since Ben had alerted him to the phenomenon, Busner has heard them. The old Bakelite phones resonating in new suit pockets and shiny patent leather handbags. The young people doing some sort of shoeplattler, slapping their thighs and hips as they hopped from one foot to the other. "You don't have to have a sort of abstract noise thingy, Gramps. You can download a tune, or even someone singing an old pop song, He'd scrolled down the options, clicking on one after another, but Gramps hadn't wanted to twist and shout, do the locomotion, or rise up on a dizzying theremin fugue. He tapped the screen. "That one, play me that one," although he'd no idea why. "Do-do-dooby-doo, dooba-dooba-doo, knick-knack, paddywhack, give a dog a bone," the synthesized tootling summoned up the old nursery rhymes words so effectively. He'd heard the voices of scores of marching Chinese orphans. But why? And why were they singing an English nursery rhyme? It hardly mattered. The important thing was, being the possessor of a smartphone with a distinctive ringtone made him able to hold the manager at bay, because with thumbs and knees and shoes and doors, the ringtone assembles a little booth around Busner, a sequestration within which I can press button A, while the manager remains impotently outside, unable to enter this very public, private space. Instead, they stand and stare, and Busner wonders if the manager is also preoccupied by the possible meanings of no caller ID, until, "On my hip," it stops. The manager gently grasps Busner's elbow and, speaking very slowly and distinctly, says, "Come along now. I hope you aren't gonna make any trouble." Slipping the smartphone into his jacket pocket, Busner replies, "Trouble? Why would I make any trouble? Besides, why do you want me to go anywhere?" "Come along now, sir," the manager says, tightening his grip. "This is hardly the appropriate place to stand about in. Oh, bloody hell, man! You're naked!" Well, as I say, that's the protagonist, one of the 4 protagonists of the novel, and he's afflicted with one of the pathologies that I see as a bizarre sort of sequel to the smartphone we all have in our pocket, because it seems to me that Alzheimer's and memory loss are indisputably shadowed by the capacity of the smartphone to replace our memory and to make it unnecessary for us to remember anything. And in a way, this development in technology is paralleled in the form of the novels themselves. If you think about a conventional novel, it tries more or less to give you all the information as a reader that you need to understand it within its own context. And this is because the novel is a form that is based on the physical codex, the actual book. But when you stop to think about it for a second, once we read digitally, There's no necessity for that self-referential and self-explanatory quality of the codex anymore. You can write a book full of illusions that nobody would grasp. It should, in a sense, liberate fiction from its need to be tiresomely diegetic, fancy word meaning simply telling you what's going on. So I'm surprised that more writers of my generation aren't returning to forms of modernism that rely far more on what we lit crits called mimesis, the showing of action, rather than its detailing or listing. And the other mental pathology that I see as implicit in the bidirectional digital media revolution is autism. And Busner's grandson, Ben, the one who set him up with the smartphone and selected his ringtone with him, is an autist. And that's why you might have noticed, if you were a sharp listener in the last passage, he repeats the end of all of his phrases, because many autists, high-functioning autists, have what's called palilalia, where they repeat the end of phrases. Anyway, in this passage, we're going to meet Ben, Busner's grandson, and Ben's mother, Camilla, who is not only the single mother of, in this scene, because we're going back a few years in time, a 12-year-old autistic boy, but also the partner of Busner's own son, eldest son Mark, who is a paranoid schizophrenic. So here we are in Camilla's head. On the A1, heading south. The hedges are in bud and greenly streaming past the car's windows. Mark's lips are moving schizily as he tosses his word salad, which is Camilla's own coinage. She catches, tosses it up in the air, and also fell to earth nowhere near, followed by in my fucking arse, how Peridolly got a sweetie. I'm not talking about you, she snaps, and Mark falls silent. Silent enough for her to hear more burbling coming from the back seat. 550, 551, 552, painfully audible despite the Vauxhall's growling engine and the wind whistling through the window's perished rubber seals. At least with Ben, there's never been any, how far is it, Mummy? Or when will we get there? No, no, she checks herself. Not at least, if only. If only he'd say these things over and over again like normal children do. Not that Camilla actually knows what normal children of his age do, not having spent much time around them. But it had to be better than these 559 egregious stereotypies. Not her words, but those of Mark's father, tossed to the top of her own word salad. She shifts her hips in the warm vinyl, adjusts the rear-view mirror, could be worse, I've all my own teeth, and feels the fart brewing beneath the gastric band of her seatbelt. When she was loading up the Vauxhall, preparatory to their departure from Bamborough, she'd found Ben already belted up in the back, the road atlas open on his lap. He was consulting the distance table on the final page. She's no idea what it is they've passed 567 times since then. Telegraph poles, lamp posts, but knows whatever they are, her son will have used them to calculate fairly accurately where we are. White out of green lettering, Catterick Garrison, 2 miles, swims into view, right on cue, followed by a slip road they grumble past. The fields to either side of the motorway are flaring bright under the late April sun. I was raped in a rape field. Were you, Miller? She quizzes herself. And by who? The reply comes back, by a rapist, obviously. Rapist, papist, therapist. I was raped by the papist therapist of my therapist in a rape field. The syllables form and reform in Camilla's aching head, As unable to resist, she's dragged back into the hateful memory, the oily stems of the plants she grabbed at as he dragged her by her ankles along the muddy furrow, the putrescent smell of the drenched vegetation, and the still shittier stench of my fear. I'm traumatized, she thinks. That thing he did to me, he did, 20 years ago, and for all of my adult life I've been traumatized. Like when you hit your head really hard, and for a while the whole world's ringing and singing the painful vibration that's you, 573, 574, which is why I've ended up like this, vibrating in time to my son's monotonous voice as he speaks the distance. He's a human milometer or metronome, and I'm shackled to his pendulum, shackled to it, and by extension to his father, a man who's so out of it on sedatives, hypnotics, and antipsychotics, he can't so much as put a hand on my knee, let alone rape me. The Vauxhall rises and falls on undulating tarmac waves, while Camilla, falling along the interminable road, cannot wait to touch down in the sanctuary of their Kilburn flat, where at last the shelving units piled up with her son's ever-increasing stuff will shield her from this radioactive landscape, and her memories, which burn brighter than 10,000 suns. He got out a penknife, opened it quite casually, cut the hem of my dress, and tore it wide apart. Rolling and tumbling past the slip road to another motorway services they can't afford to stop at, Camilla feels the farts swell more, then mutate into the familiar nagging pain of her endometry, fuck it, woman's trouble, which is how her own mother had referred to the affliction 601 times a day as she squeaked about the house in her plastic knickers. Camilla, weighed down and wonky-donkey that she is, with her autistic son in one straw pannier and his schizophrenic father in the other, wishes she had one of those hands-free earpieces so she could talk to the psychiatric granddaddy of us all. She sees herself sitting at home at her trestle table in the bay window, with the dust balls draggled into being by the long blackout curtains tickling my ankles. She feels the handset pressed so hard against her ear the cartilage crackles, and she hears herself going on, recounting the deranged doodles and crazy shading of his male line. Yet he never displays any impatience, my father-in-law, which is how Camilla thinks of Zach, unsurprisingly, since their relationship is so often re-solemnized as they jointly make their signatures, giving consent on the same miserable pro formas which authorize this test or that futile intervention. So, that's Camilla and Zach Busner, two corners of this odd quartet, and the other two corners are taken up by a man called Jonathan DeAth, who is an MI6 agent, a senior agent in the British Secret Intelligence Service, and his clandestine lover, Colonel Gawain Thomas, who is the commander-in-chief of a British tank regiment stationed in southern Iraq. And that side of the novel takes us, I guess, into still stranger territory, both in terms of technology and psychopathology and war. And I've managed somehow to lose touch with my post-it notes. So stupid to lose touch with your post-it notes. It's really, it can be the end of a literary career. I think I'll omit reading you a Gawain passage, because we're sort of getting there. No, I didn't really want, I wanted to read you some of Gawain. I'm very fond of Gawain. I interviewed British Army officers who had served in Iraq for the purposes of writing this book. And I was very much concerned to write about the Iraq War because I couldn't think of an example in serious English fiction of anybody who had written at length about Iraq. And it seemed to me that the very least we could do as a society, given our joint responsibility for the deaths of an estimated 500,000 people in the region, to at least register this epical conflict in literature. I think we've shied away from it. Last year saw the publication of the Chilcot Report that clearly established the responsibility both of the British Army, the political class, and the secret state in perpetrating an unjust war. But hey, it was a good year to bury bad news for the British state, wasn't it? And that was conveniently glossed over. I was actually back on Newsnight to discuss the Chilcot Report on the day that it came out, and I was sitting in the green room, and the faces were all there around me again. General Sir Mike Jackson, with the bags on his eyes mysteriously having disappeared in the last few years. Claire Short, who stood up in a principled way against the invasion, but rather late in her resignation from the cabinet, and various other runners and riders. And we discussed the Chilcot Report, and then afterwards we came off camera, and I was with General Sir Mike Jackson in the wings of the studio. And meanwhile, Paul Bremer, the first chairman of the Coalition Provisional Authority, the body that governed Iraq after the invasion, and arguably the body who was responsible for losing control of the aftermath of the war with disastrous results, was on a TV monitor just in the wings of the stage. And as we walked past it, General Sir Mike Jackson bent down and began to stare fixedly at the screen. And I asked him, I said, why are you doing that exactly? And he was staring at Paul Bremer's face, which was on the monitor. And he turned to me and he said, because I've never seen Paul Bremer before in my life. And I thought, how astonishing. The general who was in command of the British forces in Iraq had never seen the head of the Coalition Provisional Authority. You couldn't get a better illustration of the monumental, you'll excuse my language, clusterfuck that had taken place. Anyway, that's my view. I think one reviewer said apropos my literary style that I had buried the Iraq sections of the novel in the text. I hope they're not too buried because they were a torment for me to write, because I think it's a great responsibility to take these things on. In this passage, though, I'm going to introduce you to my military man's lover. As I say, his real name is Jonathan Daath, but everybody calls him the Butcher, part obviously because of his name, Daath, which is a sort of Frenchified form of a good old English name, Death. And, you know, there are quite a lot of deaths in England. They're mostly concentrated in East Anglia or around Colchester. And the reason why I chose the name Death for this character is that it's, in fact, the three novels track the progress of different generations, 3 successive generations of the Death family. And the Death family are indeed based on my own family. So I was looking around for a name for them that would have the same qualities as my own. In other words, be a common English noun that also had a great deal of resonance. And the Selfs are also from East Anglia. If you go up around Cromer in North Norfolk and shake a tree, somebody called Self will fall out of it. It's not uncommon there at all. So the Selfs and the Deaths are kind of up there. Anyway, enough about nominative determinism. Here is the Butcher, or Jonathan Daath, aka the Butcher, in a late scene in the novel. Sorry to give you, Bill, a little bit of a plot spoiler, since you're midway through. and he's en route on an assignment to Iraq. It's a fresh morning for June, and standing at the dropping-off point, sucking on a final gasper, the butcher feels goosebumps on his recently showered skin and the crepitation of his kippered lungs. It's always been a problem dressing for these sorts of trips, ones in which he'll traverse 20 or 30 degrees Celsius in less than 24 hours, squinting towards the low rise of the Chilterns through his Marlborough smoke. He smiles wryly, remembering the reversible jackets and other sapper-esque stratagems he'd adopted as a young intelligence branch officer. No need for that malarkey nowadays. Besides, there are some occasions on which it's best to be yourself, be spontaneous. He remembers years ago coming back from the S-Bahn at the Hackeschermarkt. The wall had only been down for a couple of years, and the middle of Berlin was full of all sorts of riffraff, watchers from the other side as well. Close to his hotel, a street whore stopped him, some poor double-denim refugee fleeing the fashion disaster which had been the old Soviet bloc. "Be yourself!" she'd cried to the cold night air, her corpse breath sullying life itself, while her hand, clutching his overcoat sleeve, had been tendoned with track marks, precocious of her to have acquired a bad smack habit so well. "Be yourself! Be spontaneous!" she'd urged him, and he'd laughed in her face. F off, Christiane F., which had been most unfair, for how could she possibly have realized the careful planning it required each and every day to be this self, that self, any bloody self at all. At security in Terminal 4, the plastic tray bumps to a halt, leaving the rollers spinning, and the butcher thinks of bluestones hauled all the way from the Preseli Hills, for this situation is pretty fucking Stone Age. The rollers are still spinning as the woman in front of him expertly hefts her baby through the metal detector's arch, and spying a little Dior clutch bag rocking to a halt, snatches it up. But the security staff are having none of this. "Excuse me, madam," has the force of a command from the one with severely pinned brown hair, who's no doubt childless. Standing on the other side of the arch, watching the playlet unfold, the butcher admires the fluidity of their union, woman and accessory, then thinks of his girlfriend, Sally, who doesn't realize he's well aware of her little subterfuge, the pill long since neglected, the diaphragm no longer inserted. It's greediness, he thinks, her hands on his meager buttocks, yanking him into her. His sperm is an ingredient she needs to make her own baby. His climax is of no moment at all. Why would you care if the fridge experiences pleasure when you get the milk out? The security guard wears elbow-length Preseli blue rubber gloves. The fashionable woman holds the FA Cup aloft, offering it to be frisked with perfect equanimity. She understands there's no statute of limitations. Radicalization might happen in the womb. Although nothing as radical as what Sally hopes for, the demographic bouleversement of a spinster birth. Over brunch at the Wolseley, she's broached the question, dipping brioche, her own increasingly doughy features, yellowy, envious. She's spoken of cycles, treatments, what might be available on the NHS, and he's batted such things aside. She'll have to go. She sees her quite happy in the provinces. True, there'll have to be numerous cycles. Around and around they'll go, hormones cranking her reproductive machinery again and again. But at long last, there'll be the dividend, a beautiful, pink and burbling trophy. Sally holds out to be taken by her sweetly boring husband. The butcher has had such a fate in mind for this, let's face it, greybeard, pushing 3 years now. The pattern is well established. The butcher will introduce her to some sheepily good-natured fellow who, feeling forever sexually enthralled to her, he's not that attractive, and what with the workout her former lover put her through, much less erotically sophisticated, will remain dutiful, faithful, and most importantly, utterly incurious. "Would you step through the detector now, please, sir?" says the other one, who's equally lardy-arsed, but with hair tied up in a turban. And suddenly tiring of the charade, the butcher flashes his diplomatic passport and steps around the arch. There's a brief flurry of concern as supervisor comes scampering along the production lines of fear. But then the butcher's gone, striding past other transiting souls who, unbelted and unlaced, are doing the perp walk of late capitalism, past glassy walls of whiskey bottles and wire baskets full of stuffed animals and neck cushions. There we go. Okay, I think it's customary at such events for I, the author, to take questions from you, the audience. I've only got time for one, so maybe somebody would like to collectively fuse the audience's puzzlement into one question and sling it at me. I'm up for it. Anybody? Yes, somebody there. Well, I think that's a very good question. No, I could repeat it. I mean, you were just asking how a review... Well, you say it again.
Do you want me to... Oh, wow, I'm loud. Okay. Yeah, sorry. I was just, for the benefit of everybody, although Mr. Solf clearly heard it, I just wanted to know what the critic meant by the fact that he was accused of burying the Iraq War in his book.
Yeah, I think that's a super good question. I wish you... Would you please come to all my events in future? No, seriously, because... I mean, I don't want to be critical of my audiences, but I often have the frankly miserable experience of trying to bring a book to an audience for 50 minutes or 55 minutes, and then I open the floor to questions, and the first question is sort of, what did you have for breakfast this morning? Or usually nowadays, what do you think of Brexit? As if, you know, all events are a sort of displacement activity before we get back to Brexit in some way. So thank you for your question. I think what the critics are referring to is the fact that the book is written in a continuous line of text for 621 pages. So there's no way, you know, there might, in a conventional novel, you might have a contents page with numbered and named chapters, one of which would be the Iraq War. So everybody could turn to that and immediately see that there was indeed. There are, I guess, about 60, 70 pages of this 600-page novel set in Iraq. But it's very important for my purposes as a storyteller that you reach them within the context of the book, rather than flipping through the pages and seeing them out of context. So, you know, it's not exactly the art that conceals art, but it's part of the artistry of the text. I'm not writing a book to try and, you know, illuminate issues. It's not a work of agitprop. But as I said before, I felt this was subject matter that other writers had shied away from as being too difficult, or because it revealed too many uncomfortable things about us as a nation and a culture, and I wanted to tackle it. So I have, and also because it suited the purposes of my themes. So, thank you for your question. Lovely question. I'll be around for a few minutes longer if anybody wants to chat, but thank you for all coming this afternoon. Thank you.